for the Department of Agriculture.
Hi, I'm Christy Caldwell, and I am the CAFO program analyst.
Hi, I'm Katie Carney. I am a CAFO inspector and process administrative coordinator.
Christy, can you go through the names on the list, because you probably have them? I don't think we have everybody up on the screen that's attending, so.
Yes, the first person I have is April Beardsley.
April, could you introduce yourself? You're muted if you're talking. Come back to her.
Bobby Taylor. To the left. Brian Poselitz.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Posowitz. I'm here on behalf of Water Watch of Oregon and Humane Voters Oregon. Thanks.
David May. David May, are you on?
Yeah, you name didn't come through on my speaker. David May, I'm with Valley Fresh Food Incorporated, Skyline Farms.
Thank you. Anna Connor.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Connor. I'm here on behalf of Center for Biological Diversity. Good to see everyone.
Ben Cron.
Ben Cron, Oregon Department of Agriculture, CAFO inspector.
Lauren Orr.
Hi, Lauren Poor, Oregon Farm Bureau.
Thank you. Armando Macias.
Armando Macias, Department of Ag, CAFO inspector.
Beth Moore.
Hi, Beth Moore, Department of Environmental Quality, Water Quality, General Permits Coordinator.
Tammy Denny.
Christy, was that Tammy? Was that Tammy Denny?
Yes, it was.
Sorry, I have a reverb. Tammy Denny, Oregon Cattlemen's Association.
Tara Heinzen.
Hi, everyone. Tara Heinzen with Food and Water Watch.
That's all I have. Tammy Stark.
Hi, Tammy Stark, just a member of the CAFO Advisory Committee and an ordinary citizen.
And then I see that Laura Heffer just connected.
Or could you introduce yourself?
Hi there, did I hear my name?
Yes. Yeah, we're just doing
okay.
introductions.
You guys hear me? You're just saying hi?
Yeah, could you introduce yourself?
Oh, yes. My name is Laura Knifer. I'm co-owner of Knifer Ranch out here in Lexington, Oregon. East side where the sun's located. And I can't wait to hear about where you guys going, especially with SB 85. It's really affecting us right now.
Is that everyone?
Dan Lethal just entered the room.
Okay. Dan, could you introduce yourself?
Hello.
There you go, Dan. We can hear you. Go ahead, Dan.
Dan Lethal. Took me a while to get on.
No problem. Thanks for joining us. Okay, we'll move to the next agenda item, which is just a review of the meeting minutes from the last CAFO Advisory Committee meeting. Are there any comments or discussion on the meeting minutes that were posted? Long awkward pause. Perfect. Thank you. So no comments. Before we jump into HighPath AI in cows, we have our state vet here to join us to talk about that. I did want to give a really quick brief update on the CAFO program in terms of Wim Matthews. So most of you know that Wim's been out for a while on leave since January. He's now back, but he's doing some special projects for the department and has decided to leave ODA starting as of June 30th. So he'll be with us for the next few months, working on some special projects for us. But in that meantime, I'll continue to manage the day-to-day operations as we look forward to filling that position with a new permanent person. So you'll hear more about that, but wanted to give folks an update since things have changed and shifted a little bit. So with that, we will pass it over to Ryan to talk to us about why cows are getting high path AI.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. So for those who I haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Ryan Scholes. I'm the state veterinarian. I've been with the department in this position about 3.5 years. Been with the department about 11.5 years total now. So yeah, I guess the elephant in the room. So cows are getting chicken diseases these days. One quick just point of clarification. There is a new name that is kind of partially being adopted for what we're seeing. So what I'll give I kind of use both interchangeably, and you'll see both used interchangeably. So the other term is bovine influenza A virus. The reason for that is highly pathogenic avian influenza refers to a disease in chickens that kills them. This is doing neither, luckily. So they've kind of started adopting that other moniker. So you'll see that kind of both ways from us. So a little bit of background on what's been happening. So back in early February, we started seeing some reports out of the Texas Panhandle from some dairies down there that were experiencing a mysterious syndrome in some of their cattle. It was reported anywhere from about 2 to 10% of the milking herd, predominantly second and third lactation cows at peak lactation. So right at the peak of that curve in their lactations. So the highest producing cows on the dairies were developing this clinical syndrome where they're for those that had advanced monitoring, their rumens would pretty much just shut down overnight. They would go off of feed. Their milk production would significantly decrease. Some of them went completely out of milk. And then for those that were continuing to produce milk, or when those that went off milk recovered, their milk was described as thickened and yellow, almost like colostrum. So again, about 2 to 10% of the milking herd saw those symptoms. But herd-wide, they were actually seeing almost a 10% decrease in milk production fairly rapidly, and then usually a decrease in feed production as well, or in feed consumption as well, herd-wide. On those clinically affected cows, they also variably saw fevers and change in fecal consistency. So, but what they were reporting was after 2 to 3 weeks, those cows were recovering. This was not being associated with any mortality. What it was being associated with those, when you have those cows at the peak of their production that sustain that big of a hit to their systems, when they come back into production, they don't come back to that peak. And so a lot of those dairies, because these were older cows, they had already crested the peak of that production and really were had decreased their production to a level where they were not going to be profitable at that point. A lot of those dairies were choosing to cull those cows. So fast forward, we were hearing reports of that through the month of February. In early March, the Texas State Veterinarian began trying to investigate. Their authorities are a little bit different than ours here. Unless they have a diagnosed condition that is listed in their rules as reportable in that species, they don't have any authority. So because there was no diagnosed condition, the Texas State Veterinarian was trying to assist. They don't have quarantine authority or authority to compel cooperation. And so they weren't getting anywhere. So USDA stepped in mid-March and started helping to test, to help offer some resources. So then March 22nd, they received samples, some milk samples from one of the dairies that was affected, and tested them and confirmed both at the Texas Veterinary Diagnostic Lab in Canyon, Texas, and at the National Veterinary Services Lab in Ames, Iowa, that milk was positive for the H5N1 avian influenza virus. Through that, so that was a Friday. Through that weekend, they confirmed 3 additional herds, 1 more in Texas and 2 in Kansas, that were also they refer to it as non-negative, but they were positive for avian influenza virus in the milk samples. 3 of those were in the milk samples. 1 actually was nasal swabs, but when they reported those results that the nasal swabs had far less virus than the milk samples did. So from there, they announced that early on. We kind of started tracking it, started assembling some resources to keep track of it, and started getting some announcements of biosecurity resources out to producers right away. And as that week progressed, we started getting more confirmations. So Idaho announced on that Thursday that they had confirmed high pathogenic avian influenza in a herd there in Idaho. Michigan also announced a herd, and Ohio had a herd confirmed last week. And then just yesterday, North Carolina announced a herd that had been detected. Kansas has 2 or 3 now. New Mexico has 2 or 3. And Texas is, I think, up to 11 now. The epidemiology on these is interesting. So those 3 southern states all kind of have similar case histories. All of those other 4 states each have 1 case, and each case shares almost identical histories, and that all 4 of those herds received at least 1 shipment of recently fresh, so 30 to 60 day fresh, first lactation cows from dairies in Texas that later began experiencing these symptoms. None of the cows that arrived on those dairies ever developed symptoms, but other cows on those dairies did, at least for Idaho, Michigan, and Ohio. The North Carolina case is also unique that they tested that one because of they traced those cows to that herd. They never did experience any symptoms on that dairy. So that history kind of prompted USDA to start talking about that, well, maybe this was transmitting from cow to cow, because we had cows that came from dairies down in Texas that were infected, came to these other dairies. Those cows were still healthy, but other cows on the farms began developing symptoms. As they started getting whole genome sequencing back on all of those samples, they realized that the virus in those 4 cases exactly matched the virus they were seeing in Texas. They also found that the virus they're seeing in those cows in Texas exactly matches what they're seeing in wild birds. It is just the wild type virus that they're seeing. The first Texas case that was confirmed, that virus was almost exactly like to the gene matched virus from a backyard poultry flock that was nearby in the area that had been previously confirmed also. So what we don't know a lot yet, but what we do know at this point is the virus in these cows appears to be, for all intents and purposes, the wild type virus that is circulating in waterfowl. Directly from waterfowl. It is the predominant strain that's being seen right now in the Central and Pacific flyways. There are no significant mutations. They're still doing a whole lot of analysis on that virus. Every time that virus replicates, little things change, and so you get a little bit of shift that doesn't have any effect. But there's no block mutations that would indicate why it's infecting cows. So it is, for all intents and purposes, that wild type virus. That's the virus circulating right now. What we're also starting to learn, it's been a little bit slow going because these cows don't die, so we don't get necropsy samples very often. But one of the farms in Texas did euthanize 2 cows and sacrifice them, necropsied them. They sent those samples to USDA, and the initial testing that was done on those, the kind of verbal report outs that we've gotten from USDA on those is that there does not appear to be any significant levels of virus circulating in those cows outside of the mammary glands and associated tissues. So the mammary glands, the lymph nodes that drain the mammary glands, that's where the virus is concentrated. We also know from the Idaho case, because the Idaho state veterinarian has shared those lab results with us neighboring states. In that case, they tested raw milk and nasal swabs. The nasal swabs were all negative. The milk samples tested with a very low CT, which in PCR testing, the lower the number, the more virus there is. So those milk samples had more virus in them than most of the swabs we have tested from infected chickens that have died from the virus. They had extremely high virus levels in them. They also found relatively high virus levels in the bulk tank as well in that herd. Those clinically affected cows had already been removed from the milking stream and were being milked as sick cows. So there likely was some virus circulating at a subclinical level in the rest of the herd. But the nasal swabs were completely negative. So that's kind of the extent of what we know. We think that it's very likely that milk is involved some way in the transmission from cow to cow. There may be some biologic transmission happening. We do know that at least one of those herds in Texas, they did find virus in nasal swabs. So it is possible that there is a point in that virus that in the evolution of the body that it is being shed in the nose. It is possible that's how it's being transmitted. It's also very possible that it is being transmitted mechanically in the milking parlor. One of the reasons we think that is that Idaho herd, when they brought 105 of those first lactation 30 to 60 day fresh cows in. They were held in a different pen in a different part of the property with a minimum of at least 300 feet of distance between that pen and any other cows on that property. And yet somehow the main milking herd got infected. Those were all healthy cows. They were being milked at the beginning of the strain. And so it's very possible that there is some mechanical transmission happening in the milking parlor, either by stripping teats or in the milking machine or something happening between there. We don't have evidence of that. One of the difficulties that's being encountered is H5N1, highly pathogenic avian influenza virus, is a select agent. It is a known bioterrorism agent. And so Department of Homeland Security frowns upon people doing research, trying to figure out how to infect animals that aren't supposed to be infected with it. So no one's been allowed to do any research yet. They're still trying to get those approvals through the process, and it's a really long administrative process to get that approval. So they're working on it, but there are some holdups there. So it may be a little while before we know exactly how that transmission happened. We do know that those 4 cases we're pretty confident came out of Texas. In Kansas, the Kansas State veterinarian has reported he's relatively confident that there is no connection to Texas herds. So in Texas, we think that there was at least one, possibly multiple spillover events where the virus made it from wild birds into dairy cows. Whether that was a biologic transmission where like those birds, the feces from those birds or some bodily fluid made it into feed or directly exposed a cow, a cow licked a sick duck, I don't know. A biologic transmission or a fomite transmission. An employee was out in the field cleaning goose poop off the tractor, the wheel well of the tractor, and came in and started milking without washing hands. Some sort of transmission there. There was at least one, possibly multiple. I think we'll know more in the coming weeks as they finish the analysis on the whole genome sequencing from all those cases. In Kansas, the Kansas State veterinarian is relatively convinced that they had at least one separate spillover event in Kansas. Those farms that have been affected they're wholly integrated farms within Kansas. They have not brought any animals in. They don't move cattle back and forth. New Mexico is a little bit unsure. They think it might be a separate spillover, but at the same time, there's a lot of movements that happen in that area between, they haven't received any shipments directly from Texas, but there have been numerous reports of other affected farms in that area. It's possible that, there were movements to those other affected farms in that, that you're seeing a secondary transmission there. Where that leaves us right now is, luckily, our dairy industry really does not import very much. We tend to see heifers leaving farms here, heifer calves or bull calves, leaving farms, going to calf ranches, going to grow outs, and then coming back home, or sometimes being sold out of state. We see very, very few instances where there's anything else coming into the state onto dairies. And even in those situations, it's almost exclusively bred heifers or younger. Going back to the beginning of 2023, we could not find a single shipment of a milking cow, of a cow that was currently lactating being shipped into the state of Oregon. So we feel pretty comfortable right now. We know there's lots and lots of shipments of bred heifers that have left Texas. Not a single one of those has resulted in an infection. We're pretty certain that the milking, the fact that those cows are lactating is connected either to the transmission or just to their ability to be infected in the first place, because that seems to be where the virus is. So for that reason, we have not implemented any movement restrictions yet coming into this state. It didn't make sense to us to restrict movements from infected states, especially when one of those infected states is a state that we have a lot of shared movement with, but there's no shared risk there. The Idaho State Veterinary quarantined that herd immediately. So we haven't had the risk there. Where I think we do have risk is the fact that we are part of the Pacific Flyway. We are a big part of the Pacific Flyway, and our dairy areas are the birds migrating through the Pacific Flyway concentrate heavily in all of our dairy areas, down in Klamath, down in Southern Oregon, down through the Willamette Valley, on the coast, Umatilla County, Malheur County. All of those areas have huge wildlife refuges that get lots and lots of birds. I think we are at risk there for new novel spillovers. This is the virus that they're seeing in these herds, the exact same virus that they're seeing in about 1% to 2% of ducks that are flying right now. So I think we do have the same risks that the poultry industry has unfortunately been living with for the last 20 or so years in our dairy industry now. And until we know how it's transmitting, all we can do is recommend biosecurity. And so that's what we've been really focusing on right now, is really recommending biosecurity. Recommending that that producers really focus on biosecurity related to waterfowl right now, especially as we enter the migration season. The spring migration season lasts a long time. The majority of the migration, though, runs from about now to about mid to late May, which is also the season where we start seeing cows getting turned out into pastures, and we start seeing forage being harvested. And so there is some risk there. We don't think that harvested forage is likely to be a huge risk, just because of the process, either the silage process or the drying and baling process with hay. But fresh forage, fresh green chop or grazing, I think there is risk if you have a field that's frequented by waterfowl. And so we're really encouraging, working with Department of Fish and Wildlife, USDA Wildlife Services, or just on your own to try to manage waterfowl access to properties. I also have a funny feeling that, similar to the poultry industry, this is probably not a risk that's going to go away. And so we're really encouraging producers to start looking at, what are the things you can do right now to, haze birds off your property, to put some fladry up, to put some scarecrows up, those kinds of things. But at the same time, what are the things long-term that, as you're making improvements to your barns, to your properties, or other things, that you can start considering and incorporating some of those biosecurity principles into? Can you, plant trees or hedges around ponds and around sewage lagoons? Ducks and geese, will land on those. There was a study that was actually just put out about 2 months ago that looked at waterfowl on those lagoons. And one of the things they found was that waterfowl love those lagoons, but as soon as you plant trees around them, they hate them. For one, it's hard for them to land and take off. The other is their predators tend to hide in those trees and those bushes. So planting hedgerows almost entirely stopped waterfowl from landing on lagoons and retention ponds. That's not something you can do tomorrow, but that's something that as as producers are looking at, things that over the next 10 years they may be considering doing. Planting some small trees now, those small trees become big trees in a couple of years. And so, just looking at some of those long-term things as well. The rising tides raise all ships. Biosecurity for this disease is biosecurity for every other disease too. So I know I said a lot and I tend to talk really fast. As you can tell, I've given this brief a few times in the last couple of weeks. I'm happy to take questions or circle back if there's things I talked too fast through. I feel really sorry for the woman sitting to my left trying to take notes as I'm talking.
Don't worry.
I'm impressed that you can keep up.
Anyone wants to?
Yeah, Ryan,
Yeah.
this is Ben Cron. I just got a couple questions for you. First off, from a CAFO standpoint, we can't recommend planting trees in the ponds, maybe around the outside, but definitely not in the dikes or the berms. It could disrupt the liners on those. But on the H5N1, Ryan, does that live in water? I mean, obviously it does, but is it something that if you got waterfall flying over and pooping in the water troughs, can it live there?
Mhm. Yeah, so I think water troughs are a huge risk. So the short answer is yes, it can survive. Depending on time of year, how much UV light you get, the survival is variable. But at 40 degrees, 35 to 40 degrees Celsius, so about, or Fahrenheit, so about 4 degrees Celsius, refrigerator temperatures, in an aquatic environment, that virus has been shown to survive for up to 120 to 160 days. So, those of us here in the Willamette Valley and on the coast, I know don't know anything about cool and wet temperatures for any part of the year, but it can be a problem over the fall and winter. Luckily, once you start exposing that virus to UV light and drying it, it is inactivated very, very quickly. So out in a pasture in the summertime, as long as the virus is exposed, it's a very short period of time. But water troughs are a huge risk. Keeping water troughs, waters, any area where animals are drinking water, that's a huge risk. Water is a huge infection source. So the other thing too with water is 2 weeks before they announced this case, that first cattle case, the state of Minnesota had announced that a group of goat kids had died from avian influenza. They had actually developed neurologic signs and died. Those goat kids were sharing a pen with a backyard flock of poultry that had died from the virus. They were drinking water out of the little kiddie pool that the ducks that were infected with the virus were swimming in. They were pretty sure that's how they got it. Drinking it, it went straight to the brain. Normally, this virus in non-target species in mammals, all the cases we've seen in mammals have been neurologic cases so far. We're really lucky this isn't neurologic disease killing cows right now. We don't want to tempt that fate.
So you mentioned it's in the milk, Ryan. Is there anything we can do to prevent it to transferring to anybody? I mean, what steps can we take to make sure it doesn't go anywhere?
Yeah, so that's a good segue to a point I forgot. The other development out of this is last week, the state of Texas announced a human case. It was an employee on one of the infected dairy farms. It was a very mild case. The symptoms were just described as mild conjunctivitis, so just kind of reddening of the eyes. The suspicion right now is that likely that employee was exposed through aerosolization in the milking parlor. So from an employee protection standpoint, a human protection standpoint, for one, if you keep it out of your cows, you don't have a risk of it transmitting to you from your cows. Humans also have just as much risk of contracting this virus the same way the cows do too. So keeping waterfowl away also helps. But in terms of if there's a risk that your cows may have, you may have this in your cows, we don't know how widespread this is yet. There isn't widespread surveillance going on right now. It's just symptomatic testing in a few places. So PPE is really important in this. Most of the PPE that to protect from this is pretty standard, I think, on dairies. Some sort in the milking parlor, boots, some sort of impermeable outerwear. So, rubber apron, coveralls that you change, that kind of stuff. Gloves and washing your hands before and after the gloves too. Those are both. It's not washing hands or gloves. It's wash your hands, put gloves on, take gloves off, wash your hands again. And then eye protection. Eye protection is a really big one that I think should be commonplace in milking parlors. And in a lot of cases is, but even just safety glasses, there are a lot of things that get aerosolized in those milking parlors. When a cut falls off a teat, when you're hosing out the teat, the claws in between, when a cow decides to wave her tail and urinate in the stands, all those things. There's a lot of diseases, not just this one, that cows have on a normal basis that can be transmitted that way. So that's another one. One of the big focuses we've been doing is kind of preparing how we would respond, making sure we have our response plans in place. We have all of our partners at the table. We've been having twice a week meetings with all of our state and federal response partners here in Oregon to make sure that we're all on the same page. But one of the big cornerstones of our response plan is providing PPE. We have a lot of PPE that we've been provided by Oregon Health Authority that was surplus from COVID. And so we have kits that will go out with us if we have a suspected case we're sampling. And then we have large kits of, 30+ day supplies for every employee on the farm that we can provide to the farm if it's confirmed positive, just because we don't want there to be any reason why a human has to be exposed or why we have to do this. And we've got the PPE, so we're going to make sure we put it to use that way. But just basic PPE, anything from that cow in a liquid form that can enter a mucous membrane. So mouth, nose, eyes, cuts, anything like that is a big risk.
From a human health risk, Ryan, does it survive pasteurization?
That is a controversial question, and it shouldn't be. Every available piece of science out there says no, it will not survive pasteurization. There's no reason to believe it would. However, no one had chicken virus in cows on their 2024 bingo card, I don't think. So it turns out there hasn't been a lot of research on the H5N1 virus and pasteurization in milk. No one thought we needed to. So every available piece of science says yes. There is research going on right now at Cornell trying to spike milk samples with this virus that they've gotten from some of these farms, culture it in the milk, and then run it through pasteurization just to have the evidence to say yes, 100% certainty it does. Avian influenza virus usually is inactivated at about 130 degrees. Pasteurization goes well beyond it. If you can kill Salmonella and E. coli, there's no reason that you should have influenza virus remaining. That being said, there have been a couple media outlets that chose to buck the available science and call that into question. And so there have been some national media reports that question whether, just because of the fact that there aren't studies out there that specifically test this specific virus in pasteurization, but there's 150+ years of every piece of available evidence saying there's no reason it shouldn't. So, but they are working on that right now to develop that body of research specifically with this virus in milk to show that it does.
So
Yeah.
what are the steps that you want producers to take if they're concerned about an outbreak on their farm?
Yeah, so there's two pathways. One is call your vet. It is a reportable condition in Oregon. In most cases, I think producers are probably more comfortable to call their vet than to call me, and I'm fine with that. Because your vet will turn around and call me, we'll work with them. In most cases, we'll meet your vet out there to help get the samples to make sure that you've got the PPE you need to make it through the next day or two while we get testing run, make sure we get the exact samples we need, all that. The other option, if you don't have a vet, your vet's not available, call us directly. We do have a reporting hotline, same one we use for birds. It's out there quite a bit. I can give it to you if you want for your notes. It's 503-986-4711. That is that during the day, it's answered by our office. After hours, it goes to our on-call veterinarian. So we do accept reports directly from producers on that line too. So yeah, if you're concerned, call us. One thing I do like to point out too, there is no cost from us. Our job is to do, this is what our job is. There is no cost for this testing. There's USDA funding available to pay for the testing. Anything USDA doesn't pay for, the state pays for. So there is no cost to one of my veterinarians showing up at your house or farm to do this testing. We need a PPE, we provide anything.
So Ryan, to be clear too, if it is found, there's not going to be any requiring culling of animals, things like that. Producers don't have to worry about that.
Nope. So our plan at this point is there will be a quarantine, but the quarantine is not to stop movement. The quarantine is to be able to essentially provide consumer confidence that we know where those products and those animals are going. So live animals, especially calves, that's a really big concern. We don't want, there's a huge humane reason why we can't stop movement of calves off some of these dairies. But we have to make sure those calves are going somewhere where they are isolated and we can monitor them. And, cull cows, we can do the same thing. And that, that milk is going for an appropriate pasteurization or going to an appropriate, get through an appropriate pathway that we're not creating risk or creating uncertainty. Looking at the different states and how they've responded, Texas and New Mexico, there is a ton of panic right now in that industry and about how the state could respond if it becomes reportable. But then you look at the 4 other states where they've had cases come in. All 4 of those states have state quarantines on those farms, and the industries are pretty much at peace. The farms that are under quarantine think it's great, think the response has been great. So that's really, we want to provide that confidence to everyone. Cows will not be euthanized. There's no, like, it's just a wait it out and then get back up and going. So there will be some public health intervention there too, but we're working with them right now to make sure that that's proportionate and appropriate. And we have offered and requested that if they go to a farm that we get to chaperone them, because I don't want someone showing up at your farm in high heels and slacks, asking to see your worker environment. And we've had those conversations with public health, and they're very, very open to that and making sure that they're there to provide resources to the employees if there's a concern. It's not like employees are not placed under quarantine. There's no isolation. It's just you get a piece of paper with a phone number, and if you have symptoms that are concerning, you call the phone number. They get someone out to you to test you, and we get results. But it just helps streamline that process on the human side so that you get the correct test at the correct time by the correct person, and it gets fast tracked rather than just showing up at your doctor and running through 30 different tests before they kind of find the backdoor loop that oh, maybe we need to test for this. So
Another question. Do you have steps that you specifically recommend that raw milk producers take?
that is a really difficult question, mainly because we don't know enough yet.
Okay.
The steps that I recommend raw milk producers take today are the exact same steps I recommend everyone else take. And that is biosecurity, biosecurity, biosecurity. Right? If you can prevent this virus from coming onto your farm, you have nothing to fear from this virus in your cows. What we do know is that this virus is present in the milk.
Mm-hmm.
It is a risk. I don't think there's any way to say it's not a risk.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know what that risk really is. We don't know if drinking that milk would potentially cause a risk to humans. We just don't know. We don't know where that risk is, and we're not going to say there's a risk where there's not, but we know that there is something there. And so it's worth being concerned about from the biosecurity standpoint to make sure that those cows are protected. So.
We have two people with questions on here. Brian, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, but is there time? First of all, I see we're kind of at the end of the agenda time, but I do have a question if it's okay to ask.
Yeah, Brian, I think the agenda is fairly light, so I think we'll have extra time, so go for it.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for all that information. I was just wondering if there are any common threads in terms of the types of operations where you found the virus. Are they big operations, small operations? Are there correlations to any types of specific practices that you found, pasture, non-pasture, anything like that?
So yes, there are some correlations. Honestly, the biggest correlations is receiving lactating cows from Texas. Turns out that's a risk. Most of the farms so far, I think, have been bigger. However, if you're familiar with the panhandle of Texas, a small family farm is usually 5,000 plus cows. And so, there aren't, what we consider small family farms here in Oregon, those don't exist in the panhandle of Texas. And so, where this started, it would be expected it would be very large farms. Most of those, those are not farms that graze. There's not a whole lot of grazing in the panhandle of Texas. And so they're just, there are some commonalities there. One thing we don't know though still is this syndrome that we're seeing, is the syndrome caused by the avian influenza virus, or the avian influenza virus just happened to be there and something else is causing the symptoms, right? Or, the Texas dairy the Idaho dairy was a very, very large dairy. They had 8 cows that showed clinical signs. That's about 0.1% of their milking herd. So if you find 8 cows in a 10,000 cow dairy, if you have 100 cow dairy, you may not see it. And so I think we're finding it to some extent because we're finding it in those large dairies because they're large dairies, and a small percentage is still a lot of cows. We don't know how widespread it may be. There is no surveillance happening yet. There's no surveillance planned to happen either. at this point because we just don't know enough. I think we're trying to learn about it as quickly as we can.
Oh, yeah, so thank you for that. Really, really quick follow-up question. The facility in the facility in Texas where these cows came from, what can you tell us about that in terms of number of, is it a dairy or is it, you know, how many cows, et cetera?
So we know very little about any of these. I know a little bit about the Idaho one just from personal conversations with the Idaho State Vet. There's very little information. To be completely honest, most of the dairies in Texas, the Texas State Veterinarian doesn't even know where they are. Unfortunately, in Texas, because it's not a reportable disease, H5N1 in chickens is reportable. H5N1 in cows is not reportable in Texas. And so he has no authority to compel them. So what's happening is veterinarians are collecting samples from dairies using their own address with a coded name, sending it into the lab. They're getting a positive. So we know there's a farm there that's positive, but we don't know where the address even is. So there's very little information we know. The 4 dairies that have received cows have all received from 4 different dairies to my knowledge. That may not be 100% true, but there's no indication that's been given they were all the same dairy. There's a handful of dairies down there in that Texas Panhandle area that have kind of bucked the trend of, you know, a lot of large dairies are using a lot of beef semen in their breeding programs and creating beef on dairy heifers, which has created a shortage of bred heifers industry-wide. And so there's a few dairies that have decided to capitalize on that and breed more of their herd dairy bulls. And then they hold those heifers until they calf. And so they're selling essentially a proven calf that's already, or cow that's already milking. And so, you know, it takes all that uncertainty out of buying bred heifers. Plus, that farm then gets to keep that calf and start the process all over again for free, because you just paid extra to buy the cow that's already calved and you're keeping that cow. So there's a few of these enterprising dairies that are doing that, and that seems to be the source of the cows, these you know, first calf cows that are going to other states. But you know, again, the information we know is kind of circumstantial at this point in a lot of ways.
Okay, thank you for all that. Appreciate it.
April, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I'm concerned about beef. If we heard anything about beef cattle grazing, if we're picking it up on these, you know, from the ducks and geese, you know, just curious about what you guys, I know prevention, but some of these grazing lands, there's no prevention out here.
Yeah. So physiologically, I don't think there's any reason to think that beef cattle are any different than dairy cattle in terms of their susceptibility to the virus. However, I think because of management, there are some differences here in terms of, because milk seems to be so heavily involved. You know, we don't know that that's the only way, but it seems to be really important. We're not seeing symptomatic cows in the heifer pen, in the dry cow pen, in the calves. You know, we're only seeing symptomatic cows in lactation. You know, there seems to be something to that. You're right. Beef cattle are just as at risk. But I think right now, every piece of what little limited information we have right now, what's making me feel a little bit more comfortable with that is, one, we don't tend to milk beef cows. And I do think that there is a huge mechanical component to the transmission here. We can't prove that, but that really seems to be pointing towards it. So I think that's what's sustaining these infections for so long. Plus, even if it is a biologic transmission, those cows are in very close proximity on a dairy, even a small dairy, they're in close proximity. Whereas beef cattle out on range are not in close proximity generally. They're very spread out. We don't see, even just with normal management diseases, we see very different diseases between beef cattle and dairy cattle a lot of times, just because of the management. Physiologically, they're the same. They just affect them differently management wise. And so I feel a little bit more comfortable about beef cattle, but you're right. We don't know enough to know that that's for sure. So biosecurity, I think, is still huge. The biosecurity is just going to look a little bit different on range than it is in a dairy.
Brian, you've mentioned mechanical milking a couple of times, but that seems to be maybe a connection of how it's getting from cow to cow. Is there recommendations for dairies on cleaning those cups beyond what they currently are? Like, what should they be thinking about as they're bringing cows through the parlor?
So in terms of the cups itself, not necessarily. I don't think anyone knows enough to know, is it the cups? Is it, hand stripping the teats beforehand and not, or, not cleaning the concrete well enough. And I don't think anyone knows. It just seems like there is a connection there, that the way that it moved through some of these herds, when there wasn't a direct exposure other than the milking parlor, the amount of virus in the milk, it seems like there's something there. One of the biggest recommendations is making sure that if you have cows that even just seem a little bit off, even if they're not off enough to move them to the sick pen, those cows are getting milked last. If it seems like maybe this pen is a little bit, not eating quite as much as they normally do, or the milk production in this pen was down a little bit yesterday, kick them to the last pen of the day if you can, or sanitize everything really well between groups, because I think there's enough evidence to show that it may be a risk. I don't think there's enough evidence to recommend specific practices there, just because I don't want to say, yeah, do this thing and have it be something slightly different that it does nothing for. So.
Hannah Connor, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. It's good to see you, Ryan. I have 3 really quick questions. So for the non-cow to cow, for the spread from avian sources, did I hear you right that everything has been tracked to wild, that there hasn't been any spread from commercial birds into cows at this point?
No, so we don't know the exact transmission route into any of these dairies at this point, other than the dairies where we have like the cows that move. We know that the virus matches what's what the predominant virus in wild waterfowl. We don't know if it moved from waterfowl into a skunk to the cows. We don't know if it was waterfowl through a person's hand, waterfowl to backyard chickens. That pathway could have been any number of things in any of these cases. What the evidence that we have right now is that virus appears to be the same virus.
All right, thank you. That's really helpful. Because I've seen reports that there's a potential that it's been spreading through feed, and that the feed was originating from poultry operations. And the reports, I think, are comparable to the reports that you were saying in terms of the spread through pasteurized milk. It doesn't seem to make sense in terms of the context, but it was interesting to read that. And then as a follow-up to Alice's question, I think I heard you say that the viral loads in milk were significantly higher than the loads that we were seeing in animals. Is there any explanation for why the loads would be so high in the milk itself?
No, so in the cases where both milk and nasal swabs have been reported, there appears to be a higher viral load in the milk than the nasal swabs. In the cows where we have necropsy tissues, the reports are that the virus seems to be concentrated in the mammary tissue, mammary glands and associated tissues. There is no hard, on that one, it's an N of 2. Right, you've got a total of 2 cows that have been necropsied at this point, because cows aren't dying from it, and so we don't have good evidence to any of that. There seems to be a predilection with this virus for mammary tissue. I don't think we know. I certainly don't know enough about it to be able to posit any sort of guesses as to why that is. That just seems to be what the current current evidence from testing shows.
Thank you. And then just one more, and this one's really fast. And was I right that there are no obligatory reporting requirements for a spread if it's found in a commercial operation, or is there a requirement for reporting? What does that look like in terms of when a spread happens and getting that information to ODA?
Yeah, so there are some states where there is not a reporting requirement. In Oregon, this is considered an emerging disease. It would be reportable under that. Knowing it's high path AI or suspecting it's high path AI, it doesn't matter what species it's in, that would be reported. This would be reportable under 3 or 4 different categories for us. So yes, there is an absolute mandatory reporting requirement.
Oh, great. That's it for me. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm Figueroa with OPB, just in case you guys are wondering what I'm doing here. Just a curious question. So, I mean, if the cows typically recover on their own, you know, experts indicate that because the milk is pasteurized, it's typically, you know, okay. And also there's a rare or like low risk that it might transmit to humans. I mean, to you, like, I mean, is there any sort of significant threat or like any concern that poses, right? You know, given that everything so far has shown to be very minimal?
Yes, yes and no. So the individual case, the cases that are happening right now, right? The case that happened in Idaho, which is the one I happen to know the most about, like that specific case, does it concern me? I mean, it does a little bit. We shouldn't be seeing a chicken disease in cows. I think anytime we have a disease that becomes comfortable in a different host, there is reason to be concerned about it, right? There's reason to study it more. There's reason to try and take biosecurity steps, those kinds of things to prevent it going forward, right? There is reason to make, you know, I have an obligation to make sure that producers in Oregon, as the state veterinarian in Oregon, that producers are aware that it's happening, that it's a risk, and what biosecurity steps are recommended to prevent it, right? Because we don't want to take those unnecessary risks. But I don't, you know, there is not a risk to, you're right, there's not a risk to the food supply right now. You know, it doesn't pose that risk. It's not killing cows. I just don't want it to get the chance to mutate and do it again. So I think that's really the big risk. You know, it's not a case where anyone's even mentioning, you know, we should be, you know, euthanizing cows that are infected or anything like that. But, you know, it's a new disease that we don't know anything about. We don't know why it's doing what it's doing. And we don't want it to give us a chance to teach us a different lesson. So it's fair.
So when the cows recover, you said that the only thing that is left is perhaps a lingering reduction in milk production. Is the viral load completely gone from the milk once the cow recovers, or how does that go?
So we haven't known this was a thing long enough to get samples 3 weeks later yet on any of these dairies. Okay. We know that from these early reports of this mystery syndrome that was happening, which we think probably is the same thing, because it was some of those later reports from this mystery syndrome that tested positive. But we can't say that for sure because we can't test those ones now. And in a lot of cases, we don't know what dairies those even were, right? Those were it was just kind of rumor of, hey, I heard, you know, through 3 or 4 different rumors that, you know, someone on this street had kind of a thing. So, so we don't know yet. We're still learning a lot about it. But it does seem that the clinical syndrome lasts for 2 to 3 weeks. That reduction in milk overall is kind of something you expect anytime a cow gets sick, right at the peak of their production. They're just not going to come back to that, you know, that high level. It's going to be a little bit lower level. We don't know if they will. I mean, we would expect them to come back if you keep them around for next year. We would expect them to come back to what normal production was. But again, we're about 3 weeks into this, right? We won't know that for another year.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks, Ryan.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. Ryan is obviously a wealth of knowledge, so feel free to connect with him outside of this meeting if you have further questions or concerns around this topic or others. Thanks, all right.
Absolutely.
You can hang out if you want, but I'm sure you have plenty of other things to do.
Yeah. Got piano recital.
Oh, that's even better.
Yep.
I will, Christy didn't keep me in line. I forgot to mention that the meeting is being recorded and that if you wanted to do public comment, to make sure to put it in the chat if you're virtual. I think we have a sign up sheet here.
We do for anybody in
for our 2 folks that are with us. So just housekeeping a little late. Sorry about that. Next up on the agenda is just a really brief update on SB 85. I know, Laura, you mentioned you were particularly interested in hearing about SB 85 and where we were at on rulemaking. So we have had our first Rules Advisory Committee meeting last Thursday. Some of you on this meeting were there, so thank you for your participation and comments in that meeting. Currently, we have 2 more RAC meetings on the calendar to work through any questions. We'll schedule more as needed. So far, that's going well. Getting some really good feedback. I think some of you are curious about how that looks going forward because you may be concerned about a permit or if you can get a permit. So I'll speak to that briefly. Right now, because Senate Bill 85 has provisions that impact any new facility, we aren't issuing new permits yet until the rules are final so that we can say clearly to a person who wants to apply for a permit what they need to do and have those rules final. So we don't have to go backwards for somebody or have somebody that's in like this weird limbo spot. And I know that's putting some pressure on people because you have timelines and you're trying to get things done. We're trying to get these rules done as quickly as we can so that we limit that impact on people while still getting really solid, clear, understandable, reasonable rules for folks. So that probably doesn't help you feel better, but I wanted to say that. So ideally, our theoretical timeline is hopefully they go to the Secretary of State in for the June bulletin, and then we will go through the normal rulemaking process of putting it out for public comment, holding a public hearing, responding to comment, and then filing the permanent rules. So we anticipate that to be sometime early fall when that all gets done, provided the RAC doesn't take extra meetings or there isn't a bunch of public comment that we need to be responsive to and changes the rules. So we're trying to do all of our homework up front. So that's kind of the timeline around SB 85. Most of you know we have our MPDS general permit that's been administratively extended since 21. Looking at Christine.
Yes,
Yes.
February 28th of 21.
So as soon as 85 is done and in the can, we'll look at updating that general permit to make sure that the new general permit aligns with those current rules. And so that process will start again. And we'll be putting out that permit again for public comments through that whole permit update process. But just know that like that'll be the next thing that we focus on in terms of permitting. There is another provision of SB 85 that we haven't picked up yet, which we will also be doing at that same time, which is the nutrient application permit. It's a new permit type for the agency that is specific to anybody receiving animal nutrients and land applying them in a guama. So if you live in one of the 3 guamas in our state and you're getting manure from a CAFO facility, a permitted facility, you would need to have this new permit type to then land apply it. So that will be some additional rulemaking that we will also stand up a RAC for to get our hands around what that looks like and how we would administer that permit. So, is there any questions around all of that? And I see Brian's hand up, but I think it's up from
It's
before.
still- Yes.
Okay. Unless you have a new question, Brian.
Amy.
All right, thanks.
No, sorry, I'll lower my hand, sorry.
You're fine.
Hi, thanks for the update and very excited that rules are moving forward with SB 85. I was just curious, did I hear, so the permit, the general NIPD's permit that's expired, is it the understanding that no new operations would be permitted under it because it's expired until there's a new one and they would have to be individual, or what is ODA's position on that?
Yeah, for when we have an expired general permit, we don't add people to that new permit until it's been updated. So it's been administratively extended for a while and we're not adding new people to it until we get a new general permit.
Okay, so that's just for the existing operations under it. Okay.
Yeah, anybody that was already on that permit remains on it. They're just administratively extended to that permit, but no new facilities.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yes, awesome.
I have gotten a lot of questions from not about the part of the rulemaking that is dictated by SB 85, but about the definitions.
Sure.
And I was wondering, is there time to ask any of those questions now, or should I'm on the rack so I can wait till next rack? I wanted to
Yeah,
Put it out there.
thanks for bringing that up. So yes, we are trying to also, while we're doing the 85 rulemaking, clarify the definition of a CAFO, make that a little more clear for folks. I certainly, if you have questions about the draft or where that's at, like I'd keep them in the rack since want the full rack to hear the questions and like be able to have that dialogue. Yeah, I know that is an effort that the agency is trying to do to help clarify where that bottom end is, so that it's not just a single, and that it's a little more clear for folks like, oh, when should I actually be reaching out and saying, hey, I think I might need something, or I'm wanting to do this. Do I need X, Y, or Z? So that's also part of the SB 85 rulemaking process that we figured, since we have the rules open and we are going through literally every single rule in that division, that it's an appropriate time to take a look at that.
I will hold my questions for next week's rec meeting.
Yeah, and I think we'll get there at next week, because we've made some really good progress. So
There's no other questions.
great. Then that takes us to partner agency updates. I know we have Beth on from DEQ, but I don't know if we have any other. Nick's on? Okay. Do we want to start with Beth and then we'll go to Nick? Do you have any updates for us, Beth?
Hi. No, I don't have any updates for you.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us.
Sure.
Nick?
Yeah, three quick updates, Isaac. I just wanted to mention. And I didn't introduce myself at the beginning of the meeting. I think I wasn't paying attention or something, but I'm Nick Peak. I'm the Ag Advisor for EPA Region 10. I'm over here in Boise, Idaho. I've been attending these meetings for quite some time. But so my first update here is that EPA headquarters has a new office, and that office was announced on March 1st, so a little over a month ago at the Commodity Classic in Houston, Texas. The name of the new office is the Office of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, and it will be led by the current political appointee, Rod Snyder, who serves as the administrator's senior advisor for agriculture. He's been doing that since October of 2021. So the whole deal with this office, it's going to support the regional ag advisors. So I'm the regional ag advisor for Region 10. We have 9 others in the 9 other regions. It's also going to support the Rural Partners Network, and it's going to attempt to facilitate closer coordination with other federal and state partners like USDA, U.S. Food and Drug Administration, as well as state departments of agriculture. It's also going to continue to host EPA's Federal Advisory Committee. It's called the Farm, Ranch, and Rural Communities Federal Advisory Committee. And, overall, my opinion is this is going to be great. It's been 2 staffers and 1 political appointee for as long as I've been an ag advisor, and it's not going to be like a huge office, but they are going to staff up to about 10 total folks, including Rod, who will lead the office. And I believe they've already got 2 or 3 up and running, and they're going to be probably through the summer getting folks into their positions there in the office. And so it's just going to help the administrator's office deal with ag and rural issues in a more comprehensive manner. They just get a lot of requests that they can't respond to. So that's a good thing. It's a big move for the agency to open up that new office in the AO back in headquarters. The next 2 updates I just want to mention deal with our Columbia River Basin Restoration Program. There's a working group meeting coming up in May, on May 22nd and 23rd. It's being hosted by EPA and the Washington Department of Ecology. It's at the Doris Morrison Learning Center in Spokane, Washington. And so these working group meetings, they kind of vary, but they usually include, discussions, breakout sessions. There's a site tour, I know, on this one. But the other cool thing about these meetings is there's also a virtual option available for the presentation parts of the meeting. And so I can forward some information on after this meeting, just if folks are interested in tuning into that from virtually. There's usually some good stuff in there. There's going to be presentations of spotlighting partners that are working in the Upper Columbia. some of the projects that have been funded. There might be an announcement by our regional administrator there as well. So it's, it's a good opportunity to kind of hear about what's going on in the Columbia River Basin Working Group and kind of what's been funded and the type of projects that are out there. And then the last thing with the Columbia River Basin Restoration Program, there was a new RFA or request for applications that was announced on March 20th. It is a $15 million competition for grants that are supposed to monitor and study toxics throughout the Columbia River Basin, which is obviously huge. Includes a lot of Oregon, a lot of Washington, a lot of Idaho, some of Wyoming, some of Montana. So there's a large swath of geography that is available for this RFA. The purpose of the RFA is to increase the number, type, and scientific rigor of toxic monitoring projects. So this RFA follows up 2 bipartisan infrastructure law funded RFAs that occurred in the last 12 or 14 months. And those RFAs funded $72 million throughout the basin, but they did not fund any monitoring activities. So this is funding strictly monitoring activities. And those previous 2 RFAs were funded by bill, but this RFA is actually funded by annual appropriations. So a little different funding mechanism, but it's still out there. Eligible entities that can apply include tribal, state, local governments, nonprofits, soil and water conservation districts, and not-for-profits institutions of higher education. The evaluation criteria for the grants or the applications that are coming in are also going to include climate change and environmental justice considerations. I think probably the most important thing is the numbers. So there's a $300,000 minimum and up to a $3 million maximum per award. The projects can be up to 5 years in length. There's a 25% non-federal match, but if a tribe is awarded a grant, then that match is waived for tribes. And we're thinking about hopefully around 5 to 10 awards being handed out under this RFA. There was a informational webinar on March 28th, and that webinar was recorded. So if folks are interested in that, they can take a look at that. And the request or the RFA closes on, May 17th. And the notification or the awards for the grants will be somewhere in the summer of 2024, probably later in the summer of 2024. So another big funding opportunity coming out of the Columbia River Basin program, and they just keep rolling out. It's pretty amazing the amount of money that's available. And that's it for me, Isaac. I'll just stop for now.
Okay, Nick, I have a question on that grant. So it's for monitoring. Are nitrates included in this package? Because I know in the other 2 Columbia River reduction grant packages, nitrates weren't considered a toxic that could be included.
Yeah, it's got to fit the definition of toxics. That being said, I've heard of toxics being monitored with co-constituents, right? Like nitrogen. But really the goal is to monitor the toxics, and obviously that comes down to a lot of times that's associated with pesticides and things like that. But it is pretty broad. I could actually put you in contact with the lead project manager, Isaac, if you'd like to ask her some questions.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm always looking for things up in that Oklahoma region. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there any other agency partners on the line that?
Hello, I'm Heather Medina, Associate. I can give an update for NRCS. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we got you. Please.
Oh, perfect. All right. So just want to share, I'll put it in the chat, some information. We just recently have information related to the Regional Conservationist Partnership Program. It's called the NOFA, Notice of Funding Opportunity, and that is due July 2nd. So we're asking this nationally for the RCP, looking at projects, either the critical conservation area or statewide, tied to Inflation Reduction Act as well. looking at addressing climate smart ag and forestry. So there's a large opportunity available. I believe $1 billion is out there for this fiscal year. And so if anybody is interested, please contact our Oregon NRCS Portland contacts there, and then also any of the basin team leaders. So I can put my email in the chat if anybody has any questions. I can, since I'm the only NRCS person here today, feel free to send me some questions. Also, just wanted to remind people, hopefully y'all have heard information related to funding for NRCS nationally, but also here in Oregon, we have Climate Smart Ag and Forestry related to the Inflation Reduction Act. So we already have had our sign up for this fiscal year. Our field staff are working on projects from producers across the country, and this is additional to our general environmental quality incentives program. But we're going to be receiving an additional large amount of funding for next year for the Inflation Reduction Act. And these areas that we're covering are forest land, cropland, rangeland, pasture land, energy, and animal feeding operations. So just wanted to make people aware of these opportunities. So you'll, if producers are interested, have producers contact their local NRCS district conservationist, and they can work with them on doing evaluations. So just wanted to pass those two hot topic items to you all. And since I didn't see anybody else at NRCS, just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Heather. Appreciate it. Okay, did we have anybody that wanted to put in public comment?
They haven't put any names in.
No names in the chat. See Laura raise her hand.
Yeah.
Laura, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, guys. That would be great. Yeah. Let me find my camera. Hi. Okay. Okay, so yeah, I do have a public comment. I definitely want to talk about the CAFO process and getting what that looks like from a small farmer, especially. And I wrote it all down so I didn't forget. And thanks for your patience. I am a junior high ag teacher, so if you hear some bells go off, that's what's going on here. It is parent-teacher conferences. I will be showing this to my ag class as soon as it comes out. We're doing curriculum on SB 85. So, and why we are unable to open our poultry butcher at this time. So let me start with a year and a half ago. We embarked on what we thought would be a straightforward process to get our small-scale poultry operation up and running. But as many of you might empathize, the road was anything but straight. Despite having a mechanical engineer in the family, my husband, co-owner of Knifer Ranch, who's no stranger to complex calculations, it took us an exhausting 4 hours just to find one relevant publication online. And it was, and this was after being redirected from WIM to NRCS, who then told us we need a grant. NRCS told us we would need a grant that they only issue in the spring to get this going. So I'll come back to this in a second, but this is when small scale producers start, March to October. So we needed to open in spring, not begin new paperwork in spring. So our endeavor to get permits spanned multiple cities, engaging with departments in Oregon, Hefner, Salem, and Boardman, each with their own procedures and pace. Pace is pretty important here. This added layers of complexity and frustration to our process, highlighting a system that appears uncoordinated and dauntingly inefficient. The example provided by the state was helpful, especially with the NWMP, the nutrient, which is wild, which is really wild in itself. But WIM provided us, and Katie too. Hi, Katie. Katie came out to see us. There was an example provided, but it barely scratched the surface of what we needed to navigate. What's more, we found ourselves constantly interacting with new faces in the regulatory offices, faces that couldn't assist us or would take months to dig up the information that we needed. So I am co-owner of Knifer Ranch. I'm also a junior high ag teacher, as I said. I have a background in contract management at PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Lab in Tri-Cities. And with Jake's engineering expertise, he works on the VIT plant in Tri-Cities. And he worked in China on many projects. We are certainly not new to tackling paperwork or complex projects. However, the CAFO permit requirements felt disproportionate to our operations, scale, and needs. And we're not alone in feeling overlooked by legislation that seems to cater to much larger operations. Our story is one of many where smaller farms struggle under the weight of regulatory framework, and they don't seem to acknowledge our unique challenges. We've invested nearly $100,000 last year, $25,000 coming from community support because people believe in what we're trying to build. Yet here we are, stalled by permits, unable to process our chickens, and forced to turn away customers. We currently sell USDA beef and pork to the local hospital in Hermiston, and we would like to add chicken to that. We operate seasonally from March to October with no capability for chicken, for poultry. We do turkeys as well, with no capability nor necessity to handle volumes that match large year-round CAFOs. The nearest USDA poultry processor is located in Idaho. It's a logistic and practical option that led us to consider building our own facility. We had $10,000 worth of chicken loaded up in our trailer, and they called us. This is the last time. This is when we decided to open it, and they called us and canceled our butcher date. So we have friends in Wallowa with an ODA facility that was able to take us. When the last time we also drove to Idaho, our trailer, the tire fell off it, and we had $15,000 worth of product on the back. It's just the logistics of loading up each chicken in a crate and driving it to another state so we could drive it back to our state. It's a nightmare. So here I stand before you asking for consideration, for support. How can we ensure that the permit process does not become an insurmountable barrier that stifles small farms? We're not asking for exemptions out of convenience, but out of necessity for regulations that recognize and support the viability of small farms. We need regulations that scale according to the size and scope of our operation. So I came with the answers too. We need to establish a dedicated small farm liaison. We need to implement pre-filled templates and checklists, especially if SB 85 will require additional paperwork like an NWMP form. That I know we can hire engineers for that, but that's thousands and thousands of dollars. So, and my husband is an engineer, although I understand that it's different subjects, but he should be able to figure this out for sure. We need to develop regional workshops and training programs, and we need to encourage legislative review and reform. That I understand our wastewater, it just doesn't, we are looking at doing 5,000 chickens this season. We're not talking about 5,000 per day. Our wastewater, what you're talking about in this paperwork, it just doesn't scale for what we're doing out here. And I think, especially with there's just such a funnel with how to sell directly, and we just need to figure this out. So right now we're not open. We're waiting for this. There's some confusion with Wim being gone about our application needs to be in first before. There's many steps missing that we've been working on this for a year and a half that we didn't realize we didn't even have the question to ask that. So it was just very confusing for it. And that's it. That's all I got. But I just want to put that out there, and hopefully we can change this or at least have a discussion about it.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for that feedback and for your public testimony today. Really appreciate it. Anyone else? No. Okay, so industry updates. Do we have any industry updates for today? All right, perfect. Well, with that, we are adjourned. And when's our next one, Christine?
July 11th.
July 11th. So mark that on your calendars, July 11th. Maybe come in person. We'll get better snacks. I don't know. See you all then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good snacks.